morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to thank the Chamber for conceiving of this series and hosting it, and the sponsors, Unite Fredericton, the Tourism Industry Association, the Brunswick Student Alliance, for sponsoring the series. I think it's a great exercise in democracy. For many people in Fredericton and across the province, the election seems quite far off yet, and certainly at the door, some people are saying there's an election coming. Which election is coming? So not everyone is such an eager spectator of politics as some are, that's for sure. But it is coming, it's coming soon. And it's great to have this series before school is done and the summer break comes and people start to move into our great summer season. I want to talk about three things here. Propelling the green transition and the economic opportunities that brings in Fredericton and New Brunswick for lasting prosperity, improving the well-being of New Brunswickers so our prosperity is better shared, and good governance. And I want to start with something that's coming up, I guess, and that is the Auditor General will be releasing her spring report next Tuesday, and one of the things she's going to be talking about is the ongoing decline in our fiscal situation in New Brunswick. And in my opinion, there's no excuse for that. We should be able to balance our books. We should not be in a deficit situation in New Brunswick outside of the context of a recession. PEI has balanced their books. Nova Scotia has balanced their books. New Brunswick is not any different, particularly from our other maritime provinces. We should also be operating with balanced books now. And certainly that's something that Greens would ensure happen. When we think about economic development, certainly as Greens, we think often about sort of two scales, local and provincial. So at the local level, we think about, people are very strongly supportive of the buy local movement, and we think of the grow local movement. There needs to be a grow local movement as well, because the more we grow our local economies, and when you think about it, really much of our provincial economy is made up of a lot of local economies, that it's important to use that kind of frame to ensure that we've got an economy or economies that are delivering for families and for communities, so that we have economies and communities where families can flourish and our communities can thrive. We need to do that, of course, within the carbon budget. Climate change is here. It's having serious consequences now, right here in New Brunswick. And so that's a new element when we think about economic development that has to be integrated into the goals and the objectives of developing our economy. We have a carbon budget in New Brunswick. It's enshrined in legislation now under the Climate Change Act, which we're about 15 million tons of carbon pollution a year now, and what we're budgeted for is to get down to just under 11 by 2030 and to 5 million tons by 2050. So when you think about that, we're really thinking about moving towards a non-carbon future ultimately, and I would argue also one that is largely waste-free. Because when it comes to it, when you think about carbon pollution, really it is a waste that we're trying to get rid of. So when we think about living within our financial means, living within our ecological means, we've got to create, of course, the conditions for development that reduces our fossil fuel-based resources. And that means development that does that actually contributes to that, and that's one of the exciting things in Fredericton. There are so many startups in that area that actually are, whose business will result in reduced carbon pollution, or businesses that are neutral in their impact. And this simple shift in focus in terms of thinking about economic development opens up a whole new horizon of opportunities for creating meaningful work, for business opportunities and economic development, opportunities in energy efficiency, opportunities in renewable energy for heat, for power, for fuel, opportunities in the bioeconomy. That's how we use our plant and animal-based materials for forests, our farms, fishing, and agriculture in ways that add value, that help propel the green transition. And I was particularly inspired by the presentations that BioNB had sponsored in their conference on the bioeconomy recently in Fredericton, where the Nordic countries were well represented, and some very interesting presentations there on how they have so effectively moved economic development forward in those countries with a strong component of growth in the area of the bioeconomy in a way that is providing a lot of economic development, business opportunities, job creation, and at the same time pursuing sustainability in their economies of reducing carbon and reducing waste. And so they talk about this very directly in terms of framing it up as part of the green transition. There are also opportunities, of course, in the local food sector, in waste management, in the knowledge sector, on top of what is already occurring, the clean tech sector, and the service sector. We think local, grow local, we think of small business, think of cooperative enterprises, we think of social enterprises that are so important as stepping stones for people who have a hard time attaching to the labor force. And we've had such great success, particularly in St. John, with seeing the effectiveness of social enterprises to provide that stepping stone to re-entering the workforce, or for the first time entering the workforce, for those who've been living in poverty. As I mentioned, we already see the appetite among our young entrepreneurs to provide products and services regarding energy efficiency, energy storage, renewable energy, local food, and bio-based substitutes for fossil fuel-based materials. Right here in Fredericton, you can think of companies like Rise, like Stash Energy, like Smart Energy, like Navico Power. The list goes on and on of new companies with exciting visions in terms of the products and services that they are providing or intend to provide. Growth in these sectors, of course, would help replace imports. And import substitution is one area of economic development that we haven't focused much on in New Brunswick. We've been focused pretty singularly on the export side of the economy, which brings new money into the province. But with import replacement, essentially we're also bringing new money into the system by retaining it here instead of sending it away to purchase products and services from outside the province that could be produced or delivered from inside New Brunswick. So import replacement is something that will make a significant contribution, and something that we would put in place in terms of a strategy to look at what have we got here that we can build on, that we can grow, that would replace imports, therefore keeping that money circulating in our own economy, creating job opportunities here, business opportunities here, and creating wealth here. So in creating the conditions, one of the things that we would focus on is establishing financing mechanisms to provide access to capital for both consumers and entrepreneurs to move forward in this area. So we would significantly shift the targeted loan guarantees and payroll rebates that currently are available for larger businesses working in the sort of export area to small to medium-sized businesses, which currently have a hard time accessing that kind of support, so that they, particularly for startups and expansions, have access to that kind of support. That if you've got a business that you want to expand, whether it's a local hardware store or whatever business you might think of, surely businesses in our local community should have access to the kinds of supports that traditionally have been available and provided to large business looking to locate in New Brunswick or expand in New Brunswick. And that's not been the case, and I think we need to change that arrangement so that there's more of an emphasis on supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, whether it's business, cooperative enterprise, or social enterprise. We need to fix, and we would fix, the community economic investment funds that exist in the province now. They've been very difficult for people to utilize. A number of businesses have tried to go in that direction, to take advantage of the community economic development investment funds that the province has created the framework for, but they turn out to be far more difficult and restricted to utilize than is the case in Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia, where they've played a significant role in the development of enterprises at the community level in those provinces by providing a mechanism for attracting investment locally that otherwise might leave the province and certainly leave the community. We need to fix that problem here. Right now, it's impossible to even utilize our RSP money or money from interest-free savings accounts as part of the investment that might flow into those funds. So we need to fix that so that we increase the availability of capital locally. We would consolidate existing economic development agencies. We've got too many, in a sense, going on in New Brunswick right now. And so between Opportunities New Brunswick and the Regional Development Corporation, in particular, we need to bring those together in a way so that they're most effective, most focused, and most efficient. We would set targets for refurbishing our housing stock and stock of commercial buildings to become more energy efficient, which would drive a lot of work and business opportunities in that sector. It would be tremendous for trades. About 85% of our building stock is in need of retrofitting. So that's years of work for contractors and tradespeoples, tremendous new demand for products and technologies as our building stock and housing stock will be retrofitted. So set clear targets. It's sort of a win-win-win situation where you're creating economic opportunities, meaningful work, cutting the costs for homeowners and businesses through reduced energy bills, and of course reducing the carbon footprint of operating those buildings and homes. And those savings then go back into the local economies, because if people aren't spending or businesses aren't spending on the energy they were wasting essentially in their buildings, then they'll have that money to spend elsewhere in the economy. We would set ambitious targets under the Electricity Act for the production of locally produced renewable energy and energy storage systems to help drive the development in that area. We've had targets, we've just about met them. They're old, they need to be ratcheted up and refocused in some ways to move us forward. And we would create rules that work for regular New Brunswick enterprises that are looking to work in that space of providing renewable power, particularly in New Brunswick. Right now, the way the rules are set up, really are set up in a way that are designed for larger enterprises to utilize. There's lots of costs and rules there that really provide barriers for smaller enterprises. So the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't fit, and we need a tailored approach for companies in New Brunswick that are working, and they seem to be popping up every day, developing renewable energy capacity in the province so that they can do this in a way that makes sense for small and medium-sized businesses in New Brunswick. So you don't have to be a large corporation to operate in this sector. The bioeconomy is one thing that fascinates me because it enables us to replace fossil-based material, relying on the tremendous resources we have in New Brunswick, in our forests, on our farms, in our fish processing and food processing sectors. Tremendous opportunities there to produce new products that are bio-based rather than fossil-based. And I'm not just talking about substituting wood for other building materials, for example, which we should have a greater focus on in New Brunswick. We're a forest-based province, and it's amazing to see increasingly just 2x4 studs being replaced by metal studs in construction increasingly. And we need to find ways of encouraging the use of wood in building materials more in New Brunswick to reverse that drift. And I'm not just talking about bio-based fuels like biodiesel, such as green diesel from wood products, particularly from pulp and paper waste. It's interesting, UPM, which used to operate in New Brunswick producing paper in the Miramichi, in Finland has a biofuel division that produces biodiesel, so a diesel product, from the waste streams of their pulp and paper mills. Pretty impressive. Lines up nicely with what Don Roberts from CIBC World Markets repeatedly had recommended to New Brunswick when the former Allward government had hired him to say, where do we need to be looking in terms of the future of the forestry sector? And he said, the bioeconomy. That's where I need to go. UPM was still here at that point, but interestingly enough, this is something they've gone into in a big way in Finland, in their home country. So, for example, you can use wood to be broken down to exploit the chemical properties there, the cellulose and the lignin, to synthesize additives and their use in adhesives and coatings and cosmetics. And we're seeing the Nordic countries doing this significantly. I think there's tremendous opportunities to collaborate with Nordic countries around this sector. But for enterprises to operate in the bioeconomy and to develop in the bioeconomy, they need access to forest resources, which are locked up right now. So we need to reimagine how we use our forest resources to really grow the bioeconomy in New Brunswick in this way. And that's going to take a significant effort because it's going to require modernizing our Crown Lands and Forests Act and taking a hard look at how our forests are modernized, or are managed, and for what, and how the wood and resources are allocated. So I made an initial go at that with a bill that basically concentrated on setting goals and objectives for a new Crown Lands and Forests Act, to sort of run through what would those goals and objectives have to look like if we were going to modernize the Act. So it led to an interesting debate in the legislature, but in the end wasn't adopted. So the opportunities in these fields are endless when we think about the green transition. Tremendous opportunities. We just have to make a decision to move in that direction and not wait for it to be foisted on us. I want to say, though, that we've got to ensure our graduates from post-secondary institutions can hit the ground running and be part of the green transition without being burdened by crushing student debt. And that's why Greens would eliminate the provincial portion of interest on student debt, as our other maritime provincial governments have. We would restore the New Brunswick tuition rebate and improve the time of completion benefit for students to help relieve that debt burden after they graduate. Tourism, as everyone says, our tourism potential is significantly untapped. There's so much ability to expand tourism in the province in a sustainable way. But I want to say just really one thing about that is important, and I think would set the scene for doing so, and that is we need to look welcoming to tourists as a province. When tourists enter our borders, either from the US or from other provinces in our country, they need to feel welcomed. We need actual welcome centers that are wonderful places to stop and visit. And we don't have that really. And so we need to invest in that. And we need public infrastructure beyond that for visitors. One of the things that's clear to me is we want our visitors to have a good experience. Our tourist-based enterprises deliver excellent experiences for tourists, but the infrastructure in some ways is lacking. So the welcome centers, and then the other thing I would add is rest stops along our 4-lane highways so that people can get out, can spend a little bit of time there, can get their bearings, see where they are, learn a little bit about the area they're in, do their texting safely, and perhaps buy some local products, some local food, and maybe that will help them plan their next visit back to New Brunswick. or to New Brunswick if they're traveling through. We lack those. We need them. The evidence in terms of the benefits of rest stops is tremendous, from the benefits in terms of increased tourism to the benefits of reduced risk and driving, reduced accident rates on the highways. And so that's something that I think would be important for DTI, the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, to focus on as part of a renewed tourism strategy. With respect to well-being of New Brunswickers, one of the things we need to do is tackle poverty and ill health head on. These aren't things that can be done simply by depending on growth in the economy. We've got to tackle them head on. So our poverty rates, rates of depression, alcoholism, drug addiction, even the loss of purpose among all too many youth, in a sense reflect a social recession, if you think about it that way. And that's something we're committed to addressing. We need better access to primary health care to improve the health of New Brunswickers, and we can do that. The doctor shortage can be essentially eliminated, in my opinion, if nurse practitioners were enabled to set up practices and be covered under Medicare. It would be less costly than physicians and provide excellent service to New Brunswickers, and would help alleviate the crush in our emergency departments and ill-health people who suffer just because they don't have access to a primary care health provider. Similarly, our ERs, which are overburdened in our cities, creating safety risks. We have patients who's at risk as a result of waiting times in our hospitals, and the directors of our major hospitals will tell you that for those patients in our ERs who need to be diagnosed, and maybe something serious, it may not be, the sort of threes as they call them, they've got to get in quicker. Another thing we can do to alleviate the crush in our ERs is to ensure that the services pharmacists can provide, where they use their full scope of practice to do minor diagnosis for diagnosis for minor ailments that can be very painful, is covered by Medicare. And this will be far cheaper and far less stressful for patients, and far better for patients than tying up the ER wards and using the entire machinery of our hospitals to deal with minor infections, for example. So our pharmacists, we need to use our pharmacists to their full scope of practice, and we need to ensure that minor diagnosis can be covered under Medicare instead of using the full machinery of our hospitals. So you see, we're using the most expensive way of treating people when we have more cost-effective options. Access to mental health care is abysmal in New Brunswick, and we need to fix that. We have a tremendous shortage of psychiatrists, particularly in Fredericton, because there are insufficient billing numbers in Fredericton for the number of psychiatrists we require. And we would eliminate the cap on billing numbers. It doesn't make any sense in 2018 to have a cap on billing numbers. The folks at Horizon tell me that there are psychiatrists, for example, who are prepared to move to Fredericton now and set up practice to work in our community here, and they can't do that because they can't get a billing number. And we have tremendous waiting times for accessing mental health care. We have an explosion in depression and anxiety syndromes among our youth, and the waiting time can be 6 months, 8 months outside of the university system to see a psychiatrist. That's just unsafe, and it's not right, and we've got to fix it. On the poverty side of things, that's something in my office as an MLA, we're dealing with folks living in poverty day in and day out and helping them navigate the system. One thing that's become clear to me is we need to change the rules that are keeping people in poverty. We need to change the rules so that people can actually get ahead, have the opportunity to get ahead. And the rules as they exist now around income assistance do not permit that. They act against it. There are barriers. So we need to change those. One simple example, just to give you a flavor of it, is for many people on income assistance, you cannot share accommodations to make what you receive under income assistance go a little further. And if you do, you're cut off. So we need to change that. We do need to pilot a basic income guarantee in this province because I'm convinced that a basic income guarantee will help raise more people out of poverty and it's certainly not happening now with our current social welfare system. So we need to take advantage of the essentially the offer of the federal government to partner with provinces to pilot basic income guarantees. We need to see that happening in New Brunswick. And we need to see the province get involved specifically in helping our cities and our regions to put in place public transportation that works, that's effective, that's convenient. We're one of the few provinces where the provincial government really doesn't see itself as having a mandate in public transportation, and we need to give the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure that mandate to work with our cities, to work with our regional service commissions, to ensure that we have reasonable public transportation so that people have access to transit to get to work and to get to medical appointments and so on. Finally, I want to say something about good governance. That's one of the things after being elected that really stuck out at me, and that is how poor our governance is. Part of the problem is, like in many provinces over decades now, the authority of the Legislative Assembly has shifted in to the Premier's office, or nationally into the Prime Minister's office, and we need to reverse that trend. It's not healthy, it's not democratic, and it doesn't provide good governance. And in part of doing that is ending the straitjacket of party discipline. We need to end that straitjacket. It's really kind of like a jail cell for many backbenchers, to bring democracy, in a sense, back to the Legislative Assembly so it can do its job of effectively serving the people who sent MLAs to the Legislative Assembly, to make sure those checks and balances in our system are operating, which they currently can't with the kind of strict party discipline we have. We need to create effective committees again, so that, for example, our Public Accounts Committee can be effective and actually do its job, and that is to ensure that public monies are being spent effectively and efficiently. Once the budget is set, the buck stops in terms of how that money is spent with the Public Accounts Committee. It's the committee on behalf of the Legislative Assembly that is supposed to ensure that public monies, once budgeted, are being spent effectively and efficiently by government departments. But it is ineffective because of ongoing political interference, which has been the case over consecutive governments, both liberal and conservative. That's got to change. And we can see elsewhere in Canada, in our Westminster system of government, where that is functioning, where it's working effectively, and we need to bring it back. Similarly, to ensure that the best legislation is coming out of our Legislative Assembly, amendments actually have to be entertained seriously and debated seriously and voted for with thought, rather than being dismissed routinely out of turn. So right now when amendments are brought forward, and I brought forward hundreds of amendments to bills to try and improve legislation so what comes out of the legislature best serves New Brunswickers, automatically, without thinking, government members at committee vote down amendments. Vote them down. The only time they tend to be accepted is if there's a minister present and the minister decides there was an oversight and that amendment needs to happen. And I'll give you an example. I proposed an amendment to ensure that the new organization responsible for cannabis sales in New Brunswick is financially accountable to the Legislative Assembly, which the legislation was not going to ensure. The finance minister saw that made sense, agreed, and the backbenchers voted to accept that amendment. But it's a rare example of an amendment being accepted. That's got to be changed. And then I want to finally say something about the public service. Its role really needs to be depoliticized. The morale in our public service is poor. Politics is reaching quite deep into our public service now. People are fearful about doing something that is going to upset the political end of things. So we have moved so far away from the notion of speaking truth to power that it's creating a big problem. Our public service is a professional public service. Our public service is filled with hardworking people who want to serve the public with its problems. And they need to be able to do their jobs. They need to be able to do their jobs, to put forward good ideas, innovative ideas, and an option, a suite of ideas for ministers to consider when it comes to policy development. And depoliticize the public service and strive for excellence, again, in public administration. Years ago, being a public servant was something to strive for, to have the opportunity to serve your province or to serve your country in the public service was something that was seen as a positive thing, something coming out of university young people wanted to do. It was an opportunity to serve. It was an opportunity to make a difference. I don't think many people feel that way anymore from outside the public service, and I think for many people inside the public service, they no longer feel that way either. And we need to change that culture. And perhaps we also need to look at how institutionally we're organized as well. But we certainly need to change that culture. And finally, we need to start our provincial government, as a provincial government, we need to start treating our municipal governments as fully grown adults, as fully blown levels of government that are capable of running their affairs. And that has not been the case, and continues not to be the case. And we need to change that and ensure, too, that at the municipal level, municipal governments have more authority to help, along with their citizens, shape the destiny of their communities. So those are the thoughts I wanted to share with you today. It's critical that we work together, that we collaborate to ensure that as we pursue prosperity for New Brunswickers, that prosperity is shared and lasting. Thank you very much.
There's a microphone at the back of the room that can pass around if anyone has any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Many of the remarks that you shared with us, many of your thoughts, probably would be shared by many of us here. I do have two areas of concern when it comes to the Green Party, and I'll deal with the first one, and if there's room, I'll deal with the second one. The first one is, unfortunately, Mr. Coon, when I look at the Green Party, I think of Rexton, I think of vandalized equipment for swim resources, I think of your national leader being cited for contempt of court. Does the Green Party condone or condemn violent protest?
Well, of course, one of the key principles of the Green Party is nonviolence, is a culture of peace. And so, absolutely, we condemn violence. There's no question about it. And it's one of the key principles that attracted me to the Green Party in the first place. Those principles, including that one, line up strongly with my values, and I think line up with the values of most New Brunswickers.
So did you, as leader of the Green Party and earlier as leader of the Conservation Council, condemn the vandalism that went on with swimming resources equipment and also the violence that occurred in Rexton?
Absolutely.
Publicly?
Well, I can't remember a particular newspaper story or quote, but I'm certain that I was crystal clear in condemning violence and damage to property, absolutely.
Okay, because the reason I ask that is because clearly in the case of fracking and Energy East, violence worked.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I don't think that's a fair thing to say.
You don't?
No.
Okay, so you don't see any connection between the violence in Kent County and a premier shortly thereafter declaring a moratorium? Well,
I think that the public opposition in the end, and First Nations opposition in the end to the development of shale gas in Brunswick was what caused the Premier to take the action that he did.
All right. I'll bring bring up my second question later.
Morning, David.
Good morning.
I'll turn around because I don't want to have my back to everybody to ask the question. Mike Leger with the Forest Products Association. You spoke a bit about bioeconomy. I think that's an area of progression for the forest sector. I agree with that. You also referenced a little bit about the experience in Finland. Now, in New Brunswick, we intensively manage at about 13% of the forested land base. I would say the Scandinavian countries intensively manage on a far bigger scale than that. To speak of the bioeconomy you envision requires wood supply on an industrial scale. How do you reconcile intensive management with your vision for a further bioeconomy?
Well, I mean, so you look at, so there's, obviously we're talking about forest management, so you're going to manage with goals and objectives, right? And so I think there's two things. One, you build those goals and objectives into your management regime. And two, a considerable part of the raw materials for producing bioproducts come from waste streams. So my example of waste streams from pulp and paper mills in Finland being the raw materials, the raw resources to create biodiesel, so a diesel fuel product. So you've got the waste streams, and then you've got, in New Brunswick's case, we, years ago, kind of set the objectives to really produce a lot of pulp quality wood in the province, and we don't have that demand anymore for pulp quality wood. But certainly that quality wood nicely plays into producing other products that might be synthesized from the chemical properties of that wood. And it's, remember, not just the wood that, and particularly necessarily not the wood that is desirable for sawing into lumber or into 2x4s and so on, but also many species that we don't utilize can be raw materials for the bioeconomy. I think of great birch, for example, which, if anyone has a woodlot, they know it's not much you can do with the great birch. I guess you can burn it, but it's not that great fuel either. But in New Brunswick, our researcher actually was able to synthesize a very useful chemical from green birch as feedstock for the production of other materials. So there's a great example of a species that's not commercially used. I think if we move more in the direction of bioeconomy, that we'll see there's a variety of species that can produce substances that will be helpful in manufacturing replacements for fossil-based products that currently aren't utilized in the current forestry system for pulp and paper, for producing lumber or sawlogs.
The question of the intensive forest management on a portion of the land base. What's your opinion on the current forest management objectives? Because without that forest management the way it is today, you're not going to be able to generate enough fiber to make any type of biorefining economical.
Well, so I guess I don't want to get down into the weeds on this, but as I said,
but I do. This is what we're here for.
Well, it's always difficult getting these forestry discussions because it quickly gets into language that excludes everyone else, and no one knows what we're talking about anymore. But look, it comes down to a question of scale in the end, I guess. That's what we can say. So it depends on the scale of production. Of course, if you're planning for a very large scale of production, you're going to have the kind of intensive management you're talking about. If you're talking about a more modest scale of production, then you don't need that intensity of management. Is what it really comes down to. So in the end, I think what we would need to look at is what is the appropriate scale of production in the bioeconomy, at least that relies on raw forest resources as opposed to waste streams, to determine what the management would look like to support that.
Thank you.
Hi, Dave.
Morning.
Two things. One, I was really glad to hear you talk about the lack of professional therapists and psychologists in the region. I think that there's a tremendous need here, and I was glad to hear that you talk about that. My question is around your party's policy, if there is one, on the rapidly rising workers' compensation rates in New Brunswick. In this riding and in the province, rates have gone up drastically over the last 3 years. We potentially, going into 2019, over 3 years, could be seeing rates go up over 90% within 3 years on small businesses, medium businesses, large businesses. Every employer pays them. There's some major issues within the workers' compensation system in this province, and I'm wondering if your party has taken a look at the workers' compensation policy, the assessments and the assessment rates, and has developed any kind of a policy that could help support the businesses in your riding and across the province. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. We haven't developed a policy on it. No, not as yet. We need to be careful not to turn a trend into destiny here in terms of forecasting where this is going to go in the future, because certainly in the past our rates were quite low compared to many other jurisdictions. So we've got to make sure the system is working for what it's designed for. We've got to make sure it's going to provide the necessary compensation for people who are injured or made sick as a result of their workplace, and do it in a way that makes sense. So, like I said, we haven't developed a policy as of yet, and so I haven't drilled deeply down into it at this point to be able to say much about it. But you know, my approach to things is to do that, to look at the issue. What are the problems? Drill down into it and see what are the options for resolving whatever the issue is to ensure that the goals and objectives of that, in this case, workers' compensation, are met effectively, and that it's done efficiently in a way that it's not creating unnecessary costs. So it requires, you know, I think, looking at the system in considerable detail to sort that out. I spent a lot more time looking at the health system because it's the biggest one. I don't know if you could say this is kind of part of the health system, but overall to sort out, you know, how can we make our health system much more effective and at the same time much more efficient. So this is something I have yet to turn my attention to in detail, and I'll need to. Thank you.
Morning, David. Paul Natcher from the Emerging Pharmacists Association. So, thanks very much for your comments earlier. I guess with respect to, I was interested in the comments on nurse practitioner expansion in the Medicare system, as well as pharmacists with respect to their use of minor ailments. We just had a conference here on the weekend, so I apologize, my throat's a bit off. We had 500 pharmacists from across the country, and as well as from Ireland, Australia, Portugal, to learn a bit from Canada and certainly from New Brunswick in terms of how pharmacists are able to use their scope here, but the funding is lacking, I guess, right here in New Brunswick. So I'm interested in your comments on how you would see the Medicare system, I guess, and maybe a bit more, maybe you can talk about that a bit more with respect to nurse practitioners and pharmacists, I guess, and how you see the party, I guess, or that rolling out in the future. I think your position is a bit more advanced, I guess, and a bit more outspoken than other parties have been so far. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks for the question. Well, and as I said, I've been looking at considerable detail of the health system to try and understand how we can improve it and improve the outcomes for people in New Brunswick. So right now, in a sense, the health system is running in one of the more expensive ways you could imagine. And so you look at all of the actors in the healthcare system, and you know, what is their potential role, what is their full scope of practice, and you realize way too much is still in the laps of physicians and physicians embedded in hospitals. So you have the most expensive practitioner in the system, and practicing in the most expensive kind of machinery in the system, which is creating high costs. So when you look at the full scope of people, practitioners operating in the system, there's tremendous opportunities. Whether it's midwives, and we have now the first midwives in New Brunswick here, we're taking the burden off of our obstetricians, who then can focus on the high-risk pregnancies. We're getting better outcomes with midwives, we know, because of the pre- and postnatal care that they can provide in a way that an obstetrician just is unable to. They are funded under Medicare as practitioners. Their scope of practice is significant, but their costs are much lower, and they don't necessarily always operate inside the hospital, which is an expensive place to operate in. The same goes for pharmacists. Pharmacists have a considerable scope of practice, which many people still don't realize in terms of diagnosis and prescribing for ailments that can be very painful. Take urinary tract infections. It defies explanation why someone should be stuck in a waiting room in considerable pain for 10, 11, 12 hours to get a prescription for an antibiotic when you can go to a local pharmacy in a matter of minutes, get that same prescription after being diagnosed with that. So yes, you can do that and pay for it, but for many people they won't do it when, you know, our culture is, we have Medicare and you don't pay for health services, so that needs to be covered by Medicare. So again, a far expensive way to do it with a pharmacist as the practitioner outside the machinery of the hospital in the pharmacy. So tremendous cost savings and tremendous relief for the person suffering from that minor ailment. I say minor, but painful. And so that's another example. And nurse practitioners, you know, I was on the waiting list for a couple of years, my family was, and we were offered a nurse practitioner, jumped at the chance, and tremendously satisfied with our nurse practitioner as our primary care provider. And so, but she's employed by Horizon, and so it really restricts the number of nurse practitioners who can work in the province as primary healthcare practitioners when they can't set up their own practices that would be covered under Medicare, much less cost than physicians. So we've got nurse practitioners leaving the province because they're unable to do that. And that's the last thing we want to see. And by the way, we have nurses leaving the province. We have new nursing graduates leaving the province because they can't obtain full-time work in New Brunswick. They go to PEI or Nova Scotia and they're offered full-time jobs. And yet we have a nurses shortage. So there's clearly something amiss in our health system. And I believe, not to go too far on this, but I believe the heart of it is related to the loss of central decision-making, local decision-making authority, and the sort of hyper-centralization of decision-making now in our regional health authorities. It's very centralized, so it's very difficult to make good decisions that make sense in our local hospitals, in our local health, in our communities, when you're at a distance from that. So this one-size-fits-all approach is not working, and it's got to change. So that's something that we would change. We need more local authority in the system so that better decisions get made that are more affordable and more effective for the Brunswickers.
So being an MLA that represents quite a few post-secondary students here in Fredericton South, I would just want to, I have a couple of questions about those policies, but I'll start with one. So you mentioned reintroducing the tuition rebate program, and so I'm going to operate on the assumption that that means cutting the free tuition program and tuition relief from the middle class. And if that's incorrect, please let me know. And so in our experience, we do see that the upfront needs-based grants that we see in the free tuition program and tuition relief for the middle class do a much better job of improving access to post-secondary for students who come from low to middle income backgrounds. And being someone who represents St. Thomas students, we know that quite a few low-income students do attend St. Thomas. For example, in 2016-17, about 40% of the students that I represent accessed the former tuition access bursary, now free tuition program. And so I'm just wondering, with the reintroduction of tuition rebate instead of maybe potentially FTP and Tarmac, I'm just wondering how that improves access and the barriers that may exist for low to middle income students with those programs, or with tuition rebate instead of the upfront need-based grants programs.
So I'm a big supporter of the free tuition program. It was in our last platform, it's something we wanted to strive towards, and I was pleased to see the New Brunswick government pick up on what the Ontario government had done, which is the free tuition program that was brought in New Brunswick. I think it's excellent. And it's been improved now with the secondary program, and the sliding scale is put in place for people who just were over the cutoff. So this would be in addition to that. Look, we have a $10 billion budget in New Brunswick, and I am convinced that with some institutional change in the way government operates, and with shifting our priorities around within that budget, that we can manage to do both. The long-term benefits, I think, are significant, and we need to do both. So it's not either or. I think that, as you know well, tuition is actually one fairly, not minor, but it's not the biggest part of the overall costs of attending post-secondary institutions. So there are a lot of other costs that are still there to pay. So we need to address the issue of debt, and so I'm actually looking forward to see what the government itself is going to announce soon, as they promised it, in terms of debt relief as well. But that's the way our party would approach debt relief.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Because I have my second question. Mike brought it up a little bit, Mr. Coon. Like I say, a lot of you've been saying about social policy and so on, I find very understandable. I can understand your position. I can agree with a lot of them. But I find when you talk about business issues, and this is where I get back to the protests and other aspects of it, it really would be good, because you're busy, you're a leader of a party, you're a sole MLA for your party, if you had somebody in your office that knew a bit about business, because I find that there's an awful lot of cherry picking going on. Mike mentioned about Finland. Your party and a lot of other environmental groups were really against the Jakopori report. Jakopori is a Finnish company. They made their living, they earned their stripes by working with the forestry industry in Finland. You quoted that with respect to using biomass, and that's kind of a lead on to Mike's question. I worked with a company for many years that developed anaerobic wastewater treatment plants around the world. When it came to Metz Farms, you remember that one, when we were trying to grow a hog industry in New Brunswick, there was a lot of protests against the waste and smell from that wastewater. There wasn't a made New Brunswick solution. We went to California. I find that there's an awful lot of picking here. We have an environmental, or had an Environmental Industries Association in New Brunswick. I find that in the last session, you were raising questions about Environ, a company based in Fredericton that tries to produce compost. We also had a situation here where New Brunswick has been a leader for many years, as Nova Scotia and PEI, in the treatment of solid waste. While Toronto was putting it on trains and sending it to Michigan, here in New Brunswick, we actually knew where that paper cup went to. We might not have been happy that sometimes it went into the landfill, but at least we knew where the waste was going to. And in a lot of cases with recycle and composting programs, especially in St. John and Moncton, things were being done. I think it'd be really useful, so it's not really so much a question, although you might want to answer or address some of the points I've raised, but if you had somebody that really reached out to the industry. I know for our company, we were involved in anaerobic treatment for 40 years, never talked to anybody from either Conservation Council or the Green Party, and it was export industry. And there's a lot of exports we can do here, bring back business to this province and grow good companies. So I don't know if there's any of those points you want to address, but I would suggest that if you could find somebody that would devote themselves to the Environmental Industries Association or those types of companies, then you could provide better examples.
I didn't see a question in there, but thank you for your comments.
Yeah, well the question is, why don't you reach it?
I'm talking to business folks all the time. I travel the province looking at what folks are doing in terms of new startups, new industry. I did a new economy tour a couple of years ago around the province to get a real sense on the ground of what's happening. So I'm not sure what you're getting at there in terms of reaching out at all, because I'm well aware of a lot of the new initiatives that businesses are taking, both business enterprises and cooperative enterprises, for that matter, all over this province. And so I guess I'm not clear as to what your question is. I mean, maybe there's particular companies you're thinking about that you're interested in me reaching out to, and I'd be happy to hear about them.
David, just one last question on carbon pricing. Speak only for the forest sector. I mean, we've reduced our emissions by over 50% since 1990. Nationally, I think Canada's somewhere around 1.5% of global emissions. Given what's happened in Ontario last night,
Something happened?
I think something happened, yeah. So Doug Ford has admitted that he's going to move towards abandoning any type of cap and trade or carbon pricing. Saskatchewan is going to challenge constitutionally the carbon pricing model that Ottawa's putting down. Manitoba has come forward with their own model, which may or may not fit in with what the feds want. If we look here in New Brunswick, if this starts to come apart at the seams, industries in New Brunswick could be at a huge disadvantage if we push forward with some sort of a carbon pricing model, which as of yet, we're not sure what it is. Looks like an output-based pricing system. What's going to be your position on that? Are we going to be martyred here for carbon pricing at the expense of competitiveness, or what's your take on that?
New Brunswick is not going to be a martyr, I guarantee you. Well, we'll see how it plays out. I mean, right now, we don't have a made in Brunswick pricing system, as you know. The province has made the decision to go with the federal pricing system for industry, for the large emitters. So that's one thing that's been decided, and then outside of that, we have kind of this odd system of just tagging existing gas taxes and saying that's a carbon price, which I don't think the feds are going to go for. So it looks like what's shaping up is we're going to see a federal carbon price put in place by January 2019 in New Brunswick. But that, of course, is all dependent on what happens to the Pan-Canadian Agreement. If the Pan-Canadian Agreement falls apart, well then everyone's going to be having to look at, what are we doing? In New Brunswick, we've got such tremendous opportunities to make the energy transition that we need to make. Does that depend on pricing carbon? Probably not. Is the revenue from pricing carbon helpful in sort of catalyzing that transition? Yeah.
So are you saying there's a way to reduce carbon emissions without putting a price on it?
Of course, regulation. You put regulation on the pollution, on the emissions. It does put a price on it, though, right? I mean, if you impose regulation on a plant to reduce its carbon pollution, that may increase their costs unless they can find a way to do it. As sometimes happens, that actually saves them money, but it's going to increase their costs. So, I mean, the whole carbon pricing issue came out of, in a sense, from industry, who said we would rather see a price on pollution rather than a regulation on carbon pollution, because that allows us to be innovative in terms of how we address a problem that we all agree needs to be addressed. So that's really its genesis originally. And then there's sort of, well, was it going to be cap or trade or direct fee or tax? And much of the country's population-wise has gone, and GDP-wise has gone to cap and trade in one form or another. And that's what Doug Ford's going to say. He says he's going to unravel in Ontario. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens to the Pan-Canadian Agreement. That's what we've got to work with right now. That's what we've all signed on to, except for Saskatchewan. And that's what we're operating under. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But there's much we should be doing now. I mean, if you look at the Select Committee's recommendations, which I know you have on climate action in New Brunswick, and the province's plan that it adopted as a result, out of, whatever it is, over 100 commitments that are there. One is around carbon pricing. So, and for me, I've always seen carbon pricing really as primarily, in the short term anyway, something that generates some revenue that you plow back into the hands of homeowners and businesses to provide them with the means to help reduce their energy costs and their energy use, and therefore their carbon footprint. And to me, that's always been the real advantage of it, because outside of industry, which is more price sensitive and is more price responsive to it, it doesn't in the difference on consumer decisions. Over the long term, it might, if it's continually ratcheted up, but in the short term, not. So it's really, in terms of reducing emissions, it's how the revenue is utilized that reduces emissions. So if the revenue goes back into people's hands and businesses' hands to upgrade the energy efficiency of their buildings, of their homes, of their offices, of their establishments, then you're getting significant benefit in terms of direct emission reductions.
One more question.
Yeah, one more super quick question. And so you mentioned improving the time and completion benefit, and we certainly agree that New Brunswick graduates are really, really overburdened with debt, and we have also lobbied for changes to the time and completion benefit, mainly doing timely degree +1, because a lot of research from the MPGC shows us that students are taking an extra year to finish their degree, and also reducing the debt cap. And so I was just wondering if you could elaborate on your party's policies in terms of improving that program.
Yeah, well, I think the two things in both of those, the 4 years, it is timely completion, but it should be tweaked to reflect the fact that many people are taking longer to finish their degrees. And the other thing, of course, is we've gone in the other direction in terms of the cap, the wrong direction in terms of the cap, and so I think we need to reverse that. It's not complicated. That those are the two things that we want to see happen that we would change. Thanks very much.